All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is Daily Vlog 2025, number 334. And this is the final daily vlog of 2025. Well, what do you mean? You still have a month. Well, tomorrow we start Daily December, which is a slightly different thing. So officially, this is the end of the daily vlogs of 2025. I know you're all heartbroken, but I have just because I have a rant to do about something another D&D YouTuber said that annoys the hell out of me because they're not the only one saying it, and it's flat out wrong. First things first, if you haven't picked up your copy of The Hearthwitch's Guide to Magic and Murder, Book 1 of the Hemlock Saga, written by USA Today bestselling author Kiri Callaghan, links are in the description down below. This is not an ad. This is not sponsored. Those are not affiliate links. I get nothing out of this. Kiri is my friend. I like my friend. I like her books. I want people to read her books. All right, so let's talk about dungeon crawls. I was watching the YouTubes, like you do, and I'm even going to see if I can't at least look at the title, because I'm not going to bring up the video because it pissed me off. You will find out in a moment why. Let's go here. So, what was it? I thought it was a short. Maybe it was. Oh no! It was on damn Instagram. Because I look at the Instagrams every so often, I think. And I'm not going to try and find it on there. So anyway, it was this conversation that this dude was having with another dude talking about old school D&D versus new school D&D. This is a really, really common topic to talk about. Especially with like OSR bros and stuff like that. We're like, that's the only true way to play Dungeons and Dragons. This new version is the worst thing ever. I do not believe this particular individual is like an OSR bro in that aspect, but I do think they do have some issues with rose tinted glasses when they're talking about earlier editions of D&D, and specifically what they're talking about. Is the idea of there used to be dungeon crawl rules in D&D, and they don't put them in there anywhere. And the theory that he posits as to why is that, well, it's because people got so comfortable with the dungeon crawl rules that the people writing Dungeons and Dragons, who are also very, very familiar with how to play Dungeons and Dragons, just forgot to put them in there because they were so used to everyone just knowing them. And so now in 5th edition, there are no rules for dungeon crawls. And that, I'm trying to come up with the exact right phraseology for this. That is a steaming pile of bullpucky. Everything about that statement is blatantly wrong. Now, is that a direct quote? I don't have the interview in front of me anymore, and I'm not even sure if I could find it on Instagram because I don't use Instagram anywhere near as extensively as I do YouTube. And so finding something that I viewed previously has never been something I've been able to do effectively on there. So I don't know if I'll ever find the exact quote. But I believe it was something to the effect of, well, they no longer have, like, dungeon turns. We'll talk about that in a second. Or, they don't have rules for like, different light sources and vision in different things of light, which is a blatant lie. I remember them specifically saying, either in the quote or in one of the comments underneath it, when someone said, yeah, this isn't true. There are just as many rules for dungeon crawls in 5th edition as there were in 4th edition, as there were in 3rd edition, as there were in 2nd edition, as there were in 1st edition. Like, this is literally you just trying to create a problem that doesn't exist. Which that statement in and of itself is not 100% true, but it's more accurate than the host's statement. So, So what are we talking about? Like, what is, the rules for a dungeon crawl? Well, in early Dungeons and Dragons, uh, they would create a lot of different rules for a lot of different situations because, and this is something that they bring up in the video, Dungeons and Dragons was started as kind of an expansion to a tabletop war game. And if you've ever played a tabletop war game, um, there are a lot of rules, but the entirety of the rules are just about combat because that's all a tabletop war game is. There aren't any rules for, leveling up your troops between matches or traveling from one place to another. Nope, it's just you set up a battle and you fight it, and that's it. Um, and it works exceptionally well for that particular genre of game. When they were creating Dungeons and Dragons, again, Gary Gygax and was it Dave Arneson, I think? Possibly. Gary Gygax and another person that I can't remember because my brain doesn't like to remember proper nouns, before creating Dungeons and Dragons, created this tabletop war game called Chainmail, which most war games at the time were kind of like World War I, World War II based, and they recreated like really big epic battles from those huge wars. They wanted one that you could do more kind of fantasy style and more medieval style combat, and that's when they created Chainmail. And then it might have been Dave Arneson that actually created a kind of a subset of Chainmail where the encounters that you were doing actually had fantasy aspects to them. And that kind of inspired both of them to start working on, well, what if instead of controlling armies, you were controlling a single character? So they came from wargaming, and that's where D&D came from. So that's one of the reasons why in almost any TTRPG on the market, but especially true of Dungeons and Dragons, generally the area that has the most rules is the combat area. Because they're coming, even 50 years later, we still have this inspiration from war games. And those had to have a lot of different rules for combat. Also, combat is the thing, and I've mentioned this before, combat is the thing that the vast majority of tabletop RPG players are going to have the least amount of experience in. A lot of people that play Dungeons and Dragons know how hard it is to look around a room to find something. That's second nature. They've had interactions where they've had to negotiate with someone or try to persuade someone or try to intimidate someone. These are all things that they have experience with. However, conjuring a ball of fire and throwing it into a room, or dancing between a bunch of different enemies that are all trying to kill you, this is something that very few, if any, tabletop RPG players have any experience in. So that's where most of the rules come from, because they have no way to kind of interpret where, or intuit where those things are going to go. So everyone that tries to argue that, well, D&D is just a war game, it's not. It spends the most time explaining rules on things that people don't understand. So what about dungeon crawl rules? Well, again, early D&D, and I've talked about this in my Temple of Elemental Evil video, in my Keep on the Borderlands video, and I think a little bit in the Ravenloft video. Old school D&D was primarily dungeon crawls. This idea of having this big sweeping story and this plot line that you have to follow just really wasn't a thing in old school D&D. You would find a place that had monsters and treasures in it. You would go in to kill said monsters and get said treasure, and then you'd come back out, hopefully with all the people that you went in with. In real old school D&D, that didn't happen often. You were going through characters pretty damn quick. And so because of that, again, because the vast majority of the population had never gone into a multi-level dungeon to kill orcs and find treasure, they made quite a few different rules for doing that. Things like dungeon turns. Dungeon turns is something that doesn't exist anymore. And the reason it doesn't exist is not because, oh, they forgot to put it in because they thought everybody knew. No, it doesn't exist anymore because no one liked it. and it was obtuse, and it didn't work. Basically, the way that dungeon turns worked is in combat. Anyone that's played D&D for a decent length of time can tell you how long does a round of combat last in Dungeons and Dragons? 6 seconds. And that is almost universal across tabletop RPGs in general. The reason why is 10 rounds of combat turns into 1 minute. So that's why they use 6 instead of to 10, because it kind of decimalizes combat in a way that you can't really do with our timekeeping methods, because time, for some odd reason, uses factors of 6. It's how it works. A dungeon turn in old school D&D was 10 minutes. And basically what that meant is whenever you did something in a dungeon, all the players could do something that would cost 10 minutes of in-game to time. And at the end of a dungeon turn, you would do things like you would make checks to see if your torches had burnt out. And other things like that. That's how you would track time in a dungeon. Is this a particularly well-created rule? Not really. It was really just meant to find a way to quantify the time you spent going through a dungeon, because at that point, one of the things that dungeon crawls was it was very resource management heavy. One of the reasons why you would leave a dungeon would be because you ran out of resources. You were low on torches, you were low on rations, whatever it was, you couldn't continue forward because you wouldn't be able to do it. And so in order to track the passage of time, which is really important, they created this dungeon turns rule. Now, is there a rule for dungeon turns in 5th edition? No. Is it because the creators went, well, everybody understands how dungeons work, so we don't need to write that one down? No. And the mere idea of that is insulting. The fact that, like, yeah, it's just, they just assume everybody knows. No. Because when we look at the other, like, unbelievably long list of minutia of rules that they put in there that everybody, quote unquote, already knows, it wouldn't make sense to talk about the fact that rolling 2 zeros on percentile dice counts as 100 instead of 0. Everybody knows that. Why in the world would they need to tell you how to read percentile dice? But they do, because they're trying to give everything that they can in order for a new player to get in. So this idea of, well, everybody knows how we're going to do it, it doesn't hold water. They still do. And again, I'm the person that got really annoyed that the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook were generally written for people that already knew how to play the game, because they never really went through all of the steps. But even in earlier versions, like the new versions go blatantly specific on this is what a role-playing game is and all that stuff. So that's one of the few things that I really enjoy about the 2024 version of the core books, is they actually are written as if they're written for someone that's never played the game before. However, even in earlier versions, 4th edition, 3rd edition, they still explained a lot of different things. So this idea of they just forgot, it's not, it doesn't hold any water. It's just, again, them trying to come up with a reason why, well, why wouldn't they put this thing that I like to use? Well, it's because people didn't use it. People didn't enjoy it. There are a lot of things in 1st edition D&D that were phased out over the years because people didn't enjoy them. Things like there used to be different experience point levels for different classes. Different classes leveled up at different speeds. You want to know why they don't do that anymore? Because it's not fun. The rogue being like 3 or 4 levels ahead of everybody else was just not fun. It didn't make the class that much more interesting. It just meant that they leveled up faster, and it didn't add anything to the gameplay. The same thing is true about dungeon crawl rules or dungeon turns. The reason that we don't have specific rules on dungeon turns is because we don't need them. Does that mean that there are no dungeon crawl rules in Dungeons and Dragons? No! There actually are dungeon crawl rules. In the latest DMG, there's an entire section called Running Exploration. And they talk about all these different ways to do exploration and turns and things like that. And part of that is applies to dungeons specifically, but it also applies to overland exploration and a bunch of other things. Because to be blunt, you don't need special specific rules just for dungeon crawls. Like there's a lot of other things. They have an entire section in the game about how to, or in the DMG, specifically talking about how to create dungeons. And in that section, it talks about, I'm sorry, I'm just looking for the specific part where they say it before I'm talking out of my ass here. There we go. So, they have a specific section just on this is how you design dungeons. And this is how you create more interesting dungeons. This is how you create dungeon maps and things like that. They don't specifically have rules in this section about how to run things, run players through dungeons. Again, that's in a different section of the book called Running the Game. But it's got everything that you would need to know to create interesting, unique dungeons. And then in the Running the Game section, they have everything you need to know about exploration without getting too much. Now, are there rules for about how long torches last in here? Technically, no. Let's go to the new player's handbook. Because they already had rules for that. And they had those in the tools section. So, artisan tools. I don't want any of these. Screw you. Adventuring gear. There we go. Torch. Starts with a T. Torch. All right. A torch burns for 1 hour, casting bright light in a 20-foot radius and dim light for an additional 20 feet. When you take the attack action, you can attack with the torch, using it as a simple melee weapon. On a hit, the target takes 1 fire damage. So we have all the rules we need to figure out how long a torch lasts. But you don't have to roll for the torch. Yeah, because that's stupid. Torches are not that random. The idea that you could create an actual torch, not like, ooh, I wrapped some cloth on a stick and we're calling it a torch. No, an actual torch that was purchased from a place that actually made it is designed to burn for a specific amount of time. That's how it's made. So does that mean that it might burn for an extra 10 minutes or be maybe a little bit, 10 minutes short? Possibly. But for the most part, on average, they're going to burn for an hour because that's how long the fuel lasts. And fuel burning is an actual scientific process. Like you can measure the exact amount of time it takes for a certain amount of fuel to burn. Anyone that's making the torches is going to ensure that they're putting the same amount of fuel into every single torch because all of that fuel costs them money. And if they're not exact or relatively exact as far as they need to be, they are going to lose money on those particular things. So no, you don't need to randomly decide when your torch goes out or when it stays. Does that make it slightly more perilous because you never know when your torch is going to go out? Technically, yes, but it also just makes it more annoying. And it's not real. Like, that's not how they really work. You can just as easily have something like a nat 1 mean that, oh, there is a flaw with your torch and now you don't have any light. Just when they're doing something else, they do a perception check, they get a nat 1, they're like, okay, well, something bad, it needs to happen here. We'll just say that your torch failed. That, in and of itself, is enough randomness for the torches to either stay lit or not. And you don't need any rules for that. For other things, he mentions like, well, they had rules for like how to look in things in like dim light. Yeah, we have that. We've had that since the player's handbook in 5.0. And again, they have rules for bright light, dim light, and darkness in 4th edition and 3rd edition and 2nd edition. They've always had those rules. I don't know where this particular guy got the idea that we don't have rules for lighting. Now, is it possible, because I don't own any of the AD&D 1st edition books, is it possible that in the DMG, in the 1st edition books, that there was additional rules for how lighting works specifically in a dungeon? It's theoretically possible. And if I do have any AD&D 1st edition fans that might have a copy of the book and might be able to post those rules in the comments, I'd be eternally grateful. But again, the reason that they didn't keep reprinting those rules is because people didn't use them. They weren't fun. Well, I enjoyed them. Congratulations. Some people enjoy drinking vinegar. That doesn't mean it's good. It annoys me so much when we have these people that look at older versions of D&D with these rose-colored glasses. And again, I get the irony when I am constantly talking about how great 4th edition was. I get the irony already. However, 4th edition was great. And nothing you guys are going to say is going to convince me otherwise. It had its flaws, but at its core, it was super awesome and fun. All right, so it just really annoys me. And again, it's especially strong if you're, by the way, if you're not familiar with what OSR means. OSR stands for Old School Revolution, and it's basically people that want to play like either the basic version of Dungeons and Dragons or like 1st edition Dungeons and Dragons. My understanding is a lot of the OSR stuff tends to be a little bit more focused on like the BECME or the BX or the basic version of D&D, where like dwarves were a race and a class and things like that. But I have seen a few OSR themed games that do go a little bit more into the AD&D 1st edition stuff. But anyway, these OSR bros and things like that, and people that are like, man, this new version of D&D is just not good. A lot of times the arguments are based entirely on either misinterpretations. In this particular instance, it's them incorrectly intuiting a motivation that just doesn't exist. He's like, well, the reason they're not doing this anymore is they're turning the dungeon crawls easy. No, the reason they're not their belief is, well, the reason they don't do this is because everybody knows how to run a dungeon crawl, but they actually don't. And so that means that there's an entire generation of D&D players that have no idea how to run a dungeon crawl. It's not it at all. The reason they're not doing it anymore is that dungeon crawls are just not that popular. Players don't want this very open-ended, very treasure-motivated and killing-motivated game. They can get plenty of that in board games. Things like Descent. Descent works exactly like that. There's not a huge amount of plot in it. You're going into dungeons and things like that. You're killing things, getting loot, and leveling up. They can play video games if they want that experience. I mean, how many different ARPGs that copy Diablo exist? Or the slightly more popular nowadays, looter shooters. Like Borderlands, where yes, it does have a story, but a lot of times the thing that people really enjoy is just going in, guns blazing, and getting cool, new, shiny shit. It's just not a popular thing to do anymore, and dedicating a decent amount of an already expensive to create book to a subject that people, first of all, don't really do very much anymore, and second of all, doesn't need all of those rules. Again, they have rules for dungeon crawls in the DMG, which I will almost guarantee this particular person either barely skimmed it or never read it. because that tends to be what happens with a lot of established dungeon masters. When the DMG comes out, the only things that they look at in the DMG are new magic items, and maybe a puzzle or a trap or two, something that they can physically use. But they never look at any of the rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide because they are Dungeon Master already. I am far too good to read this. I can't remember who it was, but I remember there was one big pundit on D&D YouTube that flat out stated, yeah, I've never actually read the DMG for 2014. And this particular person had bitched and moaned about how, 5th edition just didn't have all these rules and was too basic and there was just not enough there. Again, someone in the mindset of like a Pathfinder bro kind of thing. Though I don't think that particular person is a Pathfinder bro. But yeah, they just admitted that I didn't do that. And then they actually went and read and went, oh my, there's actually a ton of rules in here that are very, very useful. I just never looked at them because I assumed that the Dungeon Master's Guide was for people that didn't know how to Dungeon Master, and I know how to Dungeon Master. So I don't need to read it. That's for plebeians that are just starting. I am an experienced Dungeon Master. And I see this over and over and over and over with so-called experts in D&D, especially if they played a previous edition, like 3rd edition, where there were just so many rules. I just go, I already know all the rules that I need, and I already know that they took out most of the things that I like, so I'm just going to keep using my rules. I'm not going to even look at their rules, not realizing that there's tons of rules in there. So, 26 minutes into the video, what actually do you need to do for an actually good dungeon crawl? What do you need to do to run a dungeon crawl in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons? And I'm going to give you guys a spoiler. My rules here for dungeon crawling are not going to be exclusive to D&D 5th edition. However, because this particular person is claiming that there are no rules for dungeon crawls, I want to actually talk about what needs to happen for dungeon crawls. So, for a traditional dungeon crawl, the first thing you need is a dungeon. Now, as I mentioned before, I need to move a bunch of tabs over so I can actually look at them. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so, as I mentioned before, the DMG already has rules, the 2024 version already has rules for how to create a dungeon. They are in the DM's Toolbox chapter. It's chapter 3. They have an entire section on doors. That's something that you really need to focus on, folks. I know it doesn't seem like it should be something that's important. It's going to be exceptionally important in every Dungeons and Dragons game you ever run for you to know the rules about doors. So, there is a section called Dungeons in there that talks about how to map dungeons. Then, you have a section on environmental effects. Those are actually remarkably useful. They're slightly more geared towards kind of overland outside travel, but you could use them in dungeons as well. And then there's a section called Fear and Mental Stress. Another really, really useful thing for running a dungeon. All 4 of those sections, if you include the doors section, very, 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 very useful. And then the final thing, at the very, very end of the DM's Toolbox, there's a section on traps. All of these things are very, very useful. So when you are going to be running a dungeon crawl, the first thing you need is a dungeon. And the dungeon can't just be a bunch of rooms with monsters in them every so often. If you want a truly impressive dungeon crawl, you need to have things in there that are going to challenge more than just the player's hit point totals. So, you need the dungeon to have multiple rooms and things like that. That kind of makes sense. Like you might find a barracks or just a sleeping quarters area of this particular dungeon. That's a thing that has to exist there. Whether we're talking about humanoids or we're talking about monsters, if they're living in this dungeon and they're existing entirely in the dungeon, they have to have a place to rest and sleep. So you need to have enough rooms that it makes sense. Now, do you need, an outhouse room? People are normally fine with just not thinking about the fact that waste is a thing. But if you really want to, you could create a room that has refuse and stuff in it in the dungeon, and then you can hide an Utyug in it, because that's where Utyugs like to live. And Utyugs are one of my favorite monsters to throw at enemies, or to throw at players ever. They are so much fun. They're genuinely some of my favorite things in the world. I don't know why. I think it's just because I had a really good time fighting an Utyug in an Adventures League adventure, and since then I've been obsessed with them. Also, they're really weird looking. So first thing, you need a dungeon, and the dungeon has to be complex enough that it doesn't just feel like, oh, here's another room. Which encounter will happen in here? After you have the dungeon itself created, and if this is going to be a true dungeon crawl, you will probably want to make a multi-level dungeon. And here's a really, really cool little trick from my DMing toolbox to yours. You don't actually have to design all of the floors at the same time. It's generally a good idea when you're going into it to kind of have an idea of how long you want the dungeon to be, how many floors you want it to be. But you don't actually have to design any of the floors until the players are about to experience them. So generally, if you're building a multi-floor dungeon, it's a good idea at least 2 floors. You need, bare minimum, before you start, have 2 floors prepped and ready to go. After that, see how quickly they move through the dungeon. Because if you spend like a week putting in like 40 hours a week just designing this dungeon, you create this like 17 floor dungeon, and it takes them like 6 months to get through the first floor, they're probably never going to reach the 17th floor. The campaign will fizzle out well before them. Or the players themselves, or the characters themselves, will go, we've explored this place enough, let's go to somewhere else. So start off minimum of 2 floors, maybe 3 if you think your players are going to be kind of booking through it. And make them interesting. Don't just make it a bunch of, don't do the whole Final Fantasy dungeon thing where it's literally just a box with a giant maze that they have to find themselves through, and they have all these dead ends and things like that. That works great for a video game, doesn't work great for a TTRPG. So make a dungeon, make it interesting, and then populate it with more than just monsters. Traps are always a good thing, and they can be actual traps, as in one of the denizens of this dungeon has set up traps for various reasons, whether it's protection, whether it's for hunting, whatever. Or they can be effectively natural traps. You can have a spike pit, which is not so much somebody created, like put a tarp over a pit and put spikes in it. Could just be that there is a pit that things have fallen into that had sharp bits on them that is now naturally turned into this trap. And anyone that lives in the dungeon knows to stay away from that area of the dungeon because people die there. And so it's been overgrown with moss or debris, other things like that. And now it's there. Or the exact opposite. There's always been a pit there. Somebody went and created like a bridge or something over it so that you could cross it. And over the years, that is decayed to the point where now it is incredibly unstable, and it turns into a pitfall trap. So traps do not need humanoid denizens to set them in some way, shape, or form. They can just be natural things that work in the exact same way. But at the same time, you can also have, again, in 5.5, they call them environmental effects, which is basically just situations where something is different about the room that is damaging to the players. To give you some examples, I'm just going to close all this because I've got so much shit opened. And I totally closed the one that I didn't want to close. So let's try this again. So to give some examples of environmental effects, a dead magic zone. This is a really interesting thing to kind of spring on your players, because it can be a naturally occurring thing. And in addition to that dead magic zone, there might be something like a very large boulder that has collapsed and made it difficult to get through, or something else that normally the players would solve using magic, and now they can't. Other things like extreme cold, extreme heat, frigid water, that's another one that can be a lot of fun. They're exploring an area, and in order to get to the next place they have to go, this particular tunnel is not only submerged, but is also the water itself is exceptionally cold for some odd reason. And there's a number of different reasons why that might be. You might find an ice elemental on the other side, and that's causing the water to be exceptionally cold. It might just be that it's so low under ground that it just doesn't get access to any heat, or maybe the rock around it is so well insulated that heat just cannot penetrate, and so heat just never happens here. And so things like that can create a more interesting dungeon. So that's the first thing you need to do. If you want to run a dungeon crawl campaign, the first thing you need to do is create a dungeon, and you should create a dungeon that is interesting. Okay. Second thing you need for a dungeon crawl is rules for dungeon crawling. So again, I mentioned in 5.5, and I'm using the newest version right now for all this stuff, because again, I think it does an exceptional job at training new DMs. You are going to want to look at the running exploration section of Chapter 2, Running the Game. And in there, they have things about like how to use a map, how to track time, and then the various kind of actions in exploration that you can do. Ability checks, taking turns, things like that. They have an entire section on perception and how that works in a dungeon or in an exploration type area. Audible distances, they have a table that basically talks about how far away a sound can be heard, which is very, very useful when you're exploring a dangerous dungeon. You don't want to attract every monster that's ever been there. Then they have an entire section on visibility. And then they have a big section on like big travel, like overland travel and stuff like that. So you're going to need to have some rules in place for just understanding how travel works, how exploration works, how perception checks works, light. The other thing that you need to do is you do need to know the rules for things like torches. Again, torches last for an hour. So there should be an idea of how long the game has been going on in game for their torches. 9 times out of 10, when you're exploring a dungeon, you don't really need to have a separate way to track time unless you're in combat. The reason that each round is 6 seconds is because there's no possible way for the players to actually react to combat as quickly as they would in an actual combat situation. So they actually turn that into a time thing. For everything else, you generally can just base it on, well, how long have they been playing? And that does a number of different things. First, it encourages them to kind of be invested in the game. If they know that their torches are only going to last for an hour, and they take 20 minutes just, telling jokes and things like that, and then 40 minutes later, you go, oh, by the way, all of your torches are out. You need to light new torches. They go, wait a minute. I thought they last for an hour. We've only been playing for like 30 minutes. No, you've been playing for an actual hour. There really isn't a benefit to tracking in-game time differently than when you're out of combat. Can you? Absolutely. And do you need to be a super 100% stickler to? No, you've been playing for exactly an hour. Your torches are all gone. No, you don't. But it's not a bad way to keep track of time, so that resources matter. And that's another thing that's typical of dungeon crawls is resources matter. So force the players to track how many torches they brought. Force them to track how many rations they brought. If you really want to mess with them, have an expiration date for the rations. Have rations only last for a week or something like that. And have the players like write down when they purchase their rations and things like that. So as you get further and further in, eventually either they have to eat through those rations or the food starts spoiling and they no longer can progress further. But resource management does need to be a thing. And you can also track other things, like especially if you're in an actual dungeon, they need to bring wood for fires for when they camp. They will need the things like flints and other stuff like that, which do eventually wear out, but the likelihood of, like, you can run most of a campaign before you have to worry about getting a secondary flint. However, as you are going through the adventure, things can happen where they can lose things. Things like, well, as you were fighting this rust monster, when it attacked you, it actually corroded a bunch of the buckles on your backpack, and 2 days worth of rations were spilt onto the floor and fell into muck and guck and things like that, and are basically useless. Or you heard this tick, 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 as your flint dropped out of your pack and rolled around into the darkness. You're not sure if you can find it. Things like that makes resource management really, really useful and required for running a good dungeon delve. So we've got an interesting dungeon. We've got rules that makes it actually matter how you explore it, how long you explore it. Now you need to have a reason for them to explore it. You can go the story route. Really good example. There's a game. It is called The Legend of... Is it Grimdark? What is it called? Grimrock. There we go. The Legend of Grimrock. It is a fantastic old school dungeon crawl RPG. I played. I think I have. I might still have the entire playthrough of it on the channel here as one of my TJ plays with friends games. But I actually beat the game. It's a fun game. There is an actual plot to this game, which is basically you are dumped into this multi-level prison. And if you can get to the bottom of the prison and escape from it, then your sentence is commuted. However, no one's ever done that. So there's a motivation for them to continue exploring the dungeon, which is if you can get to the end, you're no longer a prisoner. That's a cool motivation. There's a lot of other motivations you can have for them to explore the dungeon. Again, the old school motivation for most dungeon crawls was there'll be lots of treasure in here and lots of shinies. And that can be more than enough to motivate player characters to go down there. You could increase the motivation by creating a world where money is a little bit more difficult to come by, or cost of living is relatively high. And so there is a huge incentive for you to go dungeon delving and stuff like that, because you could work an entire week serving in a tavern and get barely enough for your room and board. Or you could do one descent into a dungeon and have living expenses paid for 6 months. Things like that are very motivating for a lot of people. And again, if your players are coming up to you and saying, hey, we want a dungeon delve, you may not need to work that hard to motivate them. But it's never a bad thing to have a motivation. If we look at one of the most famous dungeon delves ever, Undermountain. Undermountain was a dungeon that was built underneath the city of Waterdeep before the city of Waterdeep existed. and this mage kind of explored it, claimed it as his own, and then repopulated it with vicious monsters and traps because he was a mad mage. He just went nuts. So you can have that kind of almost like Souls-like information drip. As they get lower and lower, they start finding indications that either someone is down here or things down here were designed for a specific purpose. You know, the easiest way to do that, put traps that are far too advanced to be natural, and have them guard specific facilities that have fancy things in them. And some of those fancy things might have lore explanations behind them. Like you find a gem. It's like, oh, cool, really cool gem, but it's cut in a very particular way and it's set in a very specific setting. So it's like, oh, this is very cool. You take it up to sell, and the person buying it goes, holy shit, where did you find this? This is one of the ancient stones of Goobadubad. And there was an entire civilization of Goobadubaduba. And they were the most amazing people ever, and they could fly by snorting really hard. And yeah, this is an ancient relic of their past. I'll give you 3 gold pieces for it. You know, stuff like that can make the dungeon delve that much more interesting, but you don't really need that. Again, traditional dungeon delves were just, there's cool stuff, there's monsters, we're going to go get the cool stuff by killing the monsters. Yeah. And that's really all you need to run a dungeon delve. Now, again, one of the reasons they fell out of fashion is because they are relatively simplistic. You're not really going to have a lot of memorable NPCs that you meet in a dungeon. Might there be 1 or 2 people that you kind of rescue from the dungeon? Absolutely. But the further down you go, it's going to get harder and harder for the DM to explain how a random NPC has existed long enough for you to be able to find them down there. So those kind of roleplay opportunities that are really, really popular in things like, you know, Dimension 20 and Critical Role and all those other games like that. Even Dice Camera Action had some really memorable NPCs. That's not going to be happening as much. Really intricate, unique plots don't really happen in dungeon delves. And dungeon delves are very linear because the dungeon is already designed before they go in there. So the idea of players having absolute control over where the narrative goes, technically they still can, but then they'll have to leave the dungeon. So because those things are massively popular now, dungeon delves, and have been for quite a while now, dungeon delves just really aren't as popular as they used to be. It's the same thing with West March's campaigns. There was a kind of genesis when people started learning about West March's campaign where everybody wanted to belong to a West March's campaign. And nowadays, other than Critical Role's newest campaign, which isn't technically a West March's campaign, but it's kind of similar, they just really weren't a thing for a long time. And that's the same thing with dungeon delves. They're just, people don't enjoy them because the way that people play the game doesn't support dungeon delving as much. And they do require a little bit more prep work than just like exploration on a map or something. Like you can create a map one time for your entire game world, and then the players can explore that map ad nauseum for forever, and you technically don't need to make another map. But for dungeons, they have to have a map for every single floor, every single room. It's the whole point of it. So it is a little more resource intensive for the DM without a huge payoff. Yeah. Again, interested to hear from you guys. First of all, do we have some dungeon delving fans in the audience? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, do we have anyone that disagrees with my interpretation of why dungeon delving is just not as popular anymore? Feel free to put that in the comments as well. Otherwise, again, it's going to be all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.